Good evening. Welcome to week 5 of Political Violence and Terrorism. I hope everyone had a good week and took something away from the projects you had, as well as the threat finance section of the course. Moving on to week 5. Well, first, before we move on, I just want to talk about some of the PowerPoint slides, PowerPoint presentations we had. Overall, they were pretty good, but I just want to say that you have to convey a message in your PowerPoint briefs. Use graphics, use maps, use charts, use pictures. I know I use them in my lectures, and I probably should improve them for next period. But for your PowerPoint presentations, use the bullet points; those are fine. Use the sentences; those are fine. But make sure you have complementary graphics with each one, so at least your reader is more engaged. For an example, some of you talked about attacks by Group X. AQI conducted attacks here, 10 attacks in the last decade. Well, you can list them out, but it would be much better if you showed a map of each one, so that would engage your audience a little bit better. Just some rule for PowerPoint that we're violating. For these presentations, it's okay to get wordy because they're standalone PowerPoints, but if you're giving a briefing, your PowerPoint presentation should not be sentences, it should not be words, or it should not be these long words that will turn off your audience. Your presentation should be no more than one line, very succinct bullets, graphics always, and they should complement what you're saying. So we violate the rules a little bit because we're giving standalone presentations, but for future PowerPoint briefs, those are the general rules. Another thing that nobody did, which I was a little surprised, and make sure you put it in your future PowerPoints, is you need to have a bottom line for each one, a bumper sticker for each one of your slides. And so if you're talking about history of AQIM and blah, these are the historical key points, blah 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 blah, then bottom line, and AQIM has expanded to more countries than Algeria. If that's your takeaway from that slide. Make sure you put, again, a bumper sticker for each one of your slides. So if the reader's just flipping through it, he or she knows exactly what what your point is. So that's all I'll say about the PowerPoint slides. Your papers, I'm having problems receiving them on time. If you're not going to get them to me on time, give me an email that says, this is why it's not going to be on time. This is when it's going to be, and here's a valid excuse. I was pretty lenient for the last 2 weeks, because I've been having a hard time doing it. But that leniency is kind of gonna go away. Even if you're deployed overseas, I got it. I've been deployed too, and if you can't access the internet, that's one thing. But you knew this course was coming up. You have an obligation to start handing things a little bit more timely. So I'm going to start enforcing that from here on in. And then finally, the exams. Exams I'll be a little bit more flexible on because not everyone can access them for that one day, particularly if you're deployed overseas. If you have a problem with it, you email Sharon Carrington. She should have been in touch with each one of you, but she's the administrator for the website. So she can reopen the exam, close it out, do anything that you need to. Go to her, CC me for future exams. So that should cover any of the admin portion. If there's any other questions on that, please let me know. I just want to again cover last week some of the questions that came up. Drugs and terrorist financing. A lot of you correctly surmised that, particularly when you're talking about Afghanistan and the Taliban, drugs have a lot to do with financing terrorists. One of the debates that got kicked around was, should we legalize drugs? And would that take away some of the sources of terrorist finance? Yes and no. If you legalize drugs, the terrorists can still use that to finance their operations. In fact, they control already, if you're talking about the Taliban in Afghanistan or the FARC in Colombia, they already control the drug trade routes, the supplies, the distribution, the pricing, all those things. So if you legalized it, you're not going to eliminate the threat. I just want to get that point clear. There's other reasons to legalize drugs that aren't covered in this course, but I don't think severing the drug trade or legalizing it would sever that source of revenue for the terrorists. So I think that was one point that came up, and that was actually a good debate you guys had last week. The second point that it was kind of alluded to in the Terror Inc., but it actually came out a lot in the Bin Laden cache. When we killed Bin Laden, we found a lot of his stuff and we exploited it, was what happens to terrorist financing when the organization becomes metastasized. The speaker you probably heard talked about Al-Qaeda being metastasized, that it wasn't just Al-Qaeda from Pakistan conducting these attacks. These were local-based organizations that only went to Al-Qaeda very briefly and then conducted their operations on their own. Well, in the Bin Laden cache, you saw a lot of consternation between Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the operations chief for Al-Qaeda, and then the affiliate organizations in Yemen and Somalia and in Europe. And it centered around a lot to do with money. Al-Qaeda was running short on funds. They would send out money to Yemen, and then they would find out that this money was being used for things other than terrorist operations. It was used to house people, it was used for hotel rooms, it was used for entertainment, all sorts of things. And I think that's one of the vulnerabilities of a terrorist organization that becomes decentralized. The more decentralized it is, the less control you have over the finances. And that's probably one of the vulnerabilities to look at from a law enforcement capacity. So if you want to stop Al-Qaeda or you want to hurt Al-Qaeda, look at ways, or you want to set up an information operations campaign against Al-Qaeda, look at ways how the affiliate organizations are utilizing funds from the main group. And that's a way that you can actually differentiate the organization. So it kind of wraps up the Terrorist Finance Week. This week, we talk about counterterrorism strategies. And the rest of the class pretty much focuses on, the first part was terrorism, terrorist groups. Next part's pretty much counterterrorism, what governments are doing to mitigate terrorism. And the first part looks at the counterterrorism strategies, or compares counterterrorism strategies of Europe versus the United States. And the big question that comes up is, why does Europe look at terrorism differently than the U.S.? Europe is looked at as a little bit more appeasing to terrorists, a lot less focused against the threat. The United States seems to be more focused. Every time there's an attack in the United States, there's definitely a response. Europe, you don't find that. And in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, I would say that the European countries, Germany, France, to a lesser extent England, practice appeasement against terrorism. For those of you who watched One Day in September, you saw how the Germans released the Munich bombers on a whim, just to get them out of the country. That wasn't the only time that they did something like that. They would capture, release, capture, release, capture, release, capture, release. 20 hijackers, 20 incidents of hijacking. Hijackings occurred every month during the late 60s and early 70s, and the Europeans just released it. It's actually quite a different approach than you'd see in Israel or the United States. And even now, even in London or in Hamburg, you have not necessarily Al-Qaeda affiliates, but militant Islamists speaking out on streets, speaking out in the universities, in the mosques, quite openly. This isn't a secret there. They're actually calling for jihad against civilians, and the European countries do almost nothing about it. So the Europeans look at terrorism in a different light than the Americans, and the question is why. And there's several reasons for this. Some of the readings kind of allude to it. The first is the experience in the world wars. Europe went through World War I, World War II. mass violence, mass casualties, and that caused an aversion to violence that the United States never went through. So the United States never had 20% of their country killed in a world war. France did, Germany did, England came close to that. So there's always a lack of militarization. Look at a way to not use violence to solve problems. And that can be good in some ways, but it could also lead to kind of that appeasement that I was talking about. Second reason why Europe looks at terrorism in a different way is their terrorist problem, the non-Islamic terrorist problem, wasn't as violent as the terrorism problem that we're seeing. There was no September 11th that Europe faced. When Europe faced a terrorist problem, it was ETA. The Spanish faced ETA. Italy faced the Red Brigades. To a lesser extent, British faced the IRA. And these weren't as violent as the Islamic extremists. So it became more of a nuisance to the Europeans. And they were able to view terrorism in that prism as more of a nuisance than a existential threat to their country. And the final thing is Europe had a colonial experience that the United States did not. A lot of these countries, Iraq was a British colony. You saw that in the movie Road to 9/11. France had colonies in the Middle East, colonies in North Africa. And that had a little bit more of a familiarity to these countries than the United States has. So, France wouldn't perceive Algerian terrorism in the same way that the United States would, because Algeria was almost part of France several years ago. So that's kind of the reasons why. And the articles go on how this manifests itself. Lack of coherent strategy in the European Union. There's laws on the books, but they're difficult to enforce. There's information exchanges that occur between France and Germany, but there's no authority to arrest people. There's information on terrorist funds between these countries, but no authority to actually seize those funds. So that kind of gives a skewed view on their strategy. So, the readings cover do a good job of that. And the second question I want to throw out there that the readings cover is the U.S. global war on terror successful? The readings are very pessimistic on this, but they're also, one of the readings are a little old. A lot of them were finished in 2006, 2007, 2008. I'm a little optimistic. I think, 10 years after 9/11, if you don't want to say we won the global war on terror, we've achieved huge successes. And I feel that the world would have been a lot worse had it not been for American involvement in the last 10 years. I don't always agree with American involvement, but there are some successes that I think are worth highlighting. There's a drone program that pretty much wiped out the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Afghanistan. Security assistance missions in the Philippines and North Africa. Don't hear about those in the news, but they were very successful in eliminating the threat of Al-Qaeda in these perimeter nations. We have better integration between the FBI, CIA, Homeland Defense, local law enforcement than we had 10 years ago. And again, that's not easy to do. That's something that takes time, takes relationships. Saudi Arabia 10 years ago was a hotbed for Islamic extremism, but now the government of Saudi Arabia has reformed over the last few years, and they've actually been a very good partner as far as in counterterrorism. They've also been a great partner as not supporting extremist mosques. And this, again, is a reform that's occurred in the last 5 years. And then I think a lot of this is we've seen in the Arab Spring. And yes, there's been rioting the last couple of weeks, and there's rioting in Egypt and rioting throughout the Muslim world. But there's no turn towards Al-Qaeda during the Arab Spring. No one was holding posters of Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri. So I think those are successes that need to be brought up. The readings cover failures a lot, but I just wanted to highlight the successes. So that pretty much concludes this. Look forward to your discussion points, and I'll see you next week.